Welcome to a Leader's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Joel Gunn. I got Josh back on the show with me. Josh, thanks for being back.
Good to be here.
Heard you give a talk on Friday, and that's actually kind of what I think motivated me to see if you had time to get together back on the podcast. You said something in there. There's a major shift every 500 years. Mm-hmm. And you used a couple of terms that scholars like to use, but maybe not everybody on the podcast has heard before. So when you get to those terms, if you'd unpack them a little bit and kind of their origin story. But a major shift happens every 500 years. We are going to talk about the election results as we wrap up, so remind me. But that's not the shift we're talking about.
All right. So the regardless of the civilization, so you could really break world civilizations into a number of major categories, but probably what's most known is your Eastern, your Mid-Eastern, and your Western civilizations. If you look at them, about every 500 years, there's a massive shift in understanding worldview and sort of the foundational way things are done. So predominantly talking in the terms of Western civilization, if you go back a little over 500 years ago, you're at the Great Reformation. If you go back, 500 years before that, you have the Great Schism, you have the fall of Rome, you have these different things happen about every 500 years. But what's more interesting than even the direct timeline, more interesting than even the direct timeline, are there are some common characteristics every time there's one of these shifts. And typically the shift doesn't happen like in a 5-year period. Now, you may feel the realization of the shift in a more constricted period of time, but the pattern's about 150-year lead up, followed by about a 200-year shaking out, and then about 150 years of that sort of stabilization, and then you enter into the process again. But some things that tend to happen every time there's a change in the question of where authority lies. Typically, there's a change in the measure of wealth. There's a change quite often in information. So we'll just look at the last two because we're in the middle of one of these shifts. We're on the front end of the wave, which is the move from the two words you're talking about, modernity to post-modernity. So modernity would be the period that came out of the Reformation. And in that period of time, so just sort of try and hit those things that shifted. So out of the Reformation, and we'll talk about these, there's a spiritual context to all of them, especially in really all the civilizations, but especially in Western civilization. That doesn't mean that everyone's spiritual, but it affects society as a whole. So the shift then with the Reformation was the shift to the authority being not with the church, which it had been with prior to that, but the shift to it being sola scriptura, or only Scripture, and the inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture became this big thing. But you also have these other shifts that even allowed that to happen. You have this major shift in communication because right around the Reformation, you have the invention of the Gutenberg press, mm-hmm. right? You have literacy rates begin to soar. So you couldn't really have this sola scriptura view before that because any scripture you got was by the elite who might be educated enough to read. And certainly you didn't have the Bible in your hands, right? So the printing press contributes to this. You also have a shift in the measure of wealth. And I want to be really clear when we talk about wealth because wealth is just a measure of power. At the end of the day, that's what wealth is. And so you have this move from a system where the measure of wealth was land to this move where the measure of wealth begins to become currency. Now, if you fast forward, and we'll talk more about the shift that's happened then from modernity to post-modernity, and I'll define both those for you in a minute, which is the move we're in now. Well, we see these same things shifting. We're seeing a question about what's the actual authority. If you look at it from the 5 planks of the Reformation, or the 5 things that came out of the Reformation, which were only Scripture, only grace, only faith, only Christ, only for the glory of God, there tends to be some leaning toward that it will end on only Christ. We seem to be seeing that. And there's some dangers that come from that. We can get into those in a moment as well if you want to. So you have the shift in that, but you also have a shift in the measure of wealth. currency is no longer the measure of wealth. The measure of wealth today is information. Mm-hmm. He who holds the information holds the power. Mm-hmm. That's why going into this election season, we have all of this stuff going on with misinformation and disinformation and all of this. And it's why we see the companies that are the highest valued, even on the stock market today, they may not, their tangible assets don't match their valuation. Mm-hmm. What gives them that valuation is the control of information that they have.
Yeah, and I just wrapped up a AI certification, and one of the things that we were talking in there was data is the new gold or the new oil or the new whatever currency you want to call it. For AI to work, it has to have quality data and lots of it. So whoever owns the data, especially now you're starting to see the turf wars between the newspapers saying, wait, that's my data. You can't just visit my site and give a summary to your AI client. I have intellectual property rights over that article that I wrote. They're trying to maintain their data because they know that data has value for these AI companies that aren't generating the data, or they're coming back and say, wait, you used my collection of knowledge to train your model. I should get some benefit from that. So data is becoming the new.
And that's really just a power struggle, mm-hmm. right? So you have that change. You have a change in communication. I mean, it's so strange how quickly we can become conditioned to something. Mm-hmm. What iPhone just came out, 15? 16. So we're 16 years into smartphones?
More or less.
And you would think we've had them for all of time. So the change in communication has shifted, even from, what moved to written, then you communicated by, we got news through the newspaper. We sent letters. We received letters, all of these kind of things. I can't remember when the last time was email. I put a stamp on something. Mm-hmm. Now we have this technology moving. So there's something that happens technologically in these shifts. But it's something that happens all the time. So to define those terms, modernity sort of arrived at this sola scriptura kind of standpoint, but was very empirical. We have the explosion of science. Mm-hmm. And lest we forget, the explosion of science was not only directly related to the church, in many cases, it was directly funded by the church. Now, there are those people who will go, well, wait a minute, what about Galileo? You're right. You're going to have the people who want to run to some exception. Well, we can have those conversations. There's exceptions to the rule, but even Galileo was funded by the church. And we can have a whole conversation about how he was treated and why he was treated that way. And most people have a distortion of what really went down there. But science, the scientific method, the empirical way of doing things helped drive that. And so modern thinkers tend to be very logical, discount experience. What's the motto right now? Facts don't care about your feelings, right? So that's this holding on to this modern ideology and modern place, which the other interesting thing is when you grow up in it and you're conditioned in it, it's a part of your identity. You can't just flip a switch and suddenly go, okay, I'm going to be different. You have to work to have an understanding of the other side and try and find these meeting grounds. And if we make it through this shift without bloodshed, it'll be the first time it's ever happened inside the church or outside the church, which is interesting as well.
And when you say first time ever, you mean
in these shifts
in thousands of years? Yes.
Yeah, that there hasn't been bloodshed during the shift because of the actual shift. So that's sort of what became known as modernity. So now you have post-modernity, which it's post to that. You sometimes hear it referred to as post-Christian, but it's really the rise of relativism. And so I'll give you a couple of points just to show how this started back in the 1800s. So we've been in this, like I said, there's this process of leading up to, then there's the shakeout, then there's the settling in. We just happen to be in the shakeout kind of area of time. So you have this sola scriptura for all of society, believers or not, as sort of the moral compass, sort of the place to go to. And then you have 1800s, we could parse out many more of these. I'm going to try and just hit three things that happen. One, what's the Great War that happens in the United States?
Civil War.
What's the topic?
Slavery.
I mean, at its core, it's slavery. We can talk about it being states' rights. We know it, whatever, right? But it's slavery at its core. And you have this first sort of chink against the idea of sola scriptura, which is slavery's wrong. Slavery should be abolished. Slavery should be illegal. But there's Christians who own slaves in Scripture and in the current day. So you see this dichotomy that begins to emerge. And then you can go forward from there. You have the same sort of dichotomy happen with women's suffrage, right? And so you have this literalist view of Scripture that now is having well, literally, that doesn't seem to be where we want to be. So you've got slavery, you've got women's suffrage, you've got Darwin, who writes his paper, which is a direct attack to a literalist 6-day creation only. And it's interesting to see, even in our lifetimes, we've seen a shift that no one seems to want to acknowledge on within the church. And just be clear, I believe in the creation. I believe in the biblical story. I haven't wavered from those things. But in my lifetime, we've seen a move from the church and believers should have absolutely no conversations about evolution or about survival of the fittest or about adaptation to micro and macro evolution being terminology that's used, because we know that there's microevolution. It's just clear, right? We can see it. But when we were kids growing up, how dare you say something like that? How dare you suggest that? So you have this other chink against this idea of a literalist sola scriptura. And then you really have some movement with Einstein. And Einstein, if you go back and read some of the things he wrote about his theory of relativity, he was actually heartbroken by it. He almost prophetically foresaw that it could really disrupt things. That, light could be both a particle and there was a relativity to it. And so now you have all these things that just begin to sort of compile their way forward, that leads to this shift that we've been in of, okay, if that's not the authority in the literal sense, then what is the authority and how do we approach that? And it's a convoluted thing, and it's tough. I'm sitting here as I'm saying some of this thinking, there's someone watching this that thinks this guy doesn't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, and that's nothing could be further from the truth. I definitely believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. I think I fall in that place where definitely my liberal friends think I'm way overly conservative, and there's probably a few of my conservative friends that think I'm liberal. But we run in that fear of are we rejecting, are we jettisoning something, and we don't want to jettison just to jettison. But that's that tension that the world lives in now.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you put a lot of the tension in context of the church or Christianity. What was going on in your research and reading up on this? What was going on outside the religious setting?
Yes, I put it in the terms of that because the question is, where does the authority lie, not just where does the belief lie. So this was the authority, and it was the moral compass. So when we for society as a whole,
at large, yeah.
So when we grew up, dry counties, right? When we grew up, businesses weren't open on Sunday.
Yeah. Blue laws,
all of those things, right? So you didn't have to be a Christian to have this still be your authority. So I like the way you asked that question, because it's important to realize this is not something that's secluded to people who profess to a certain faith. This was the answer of where the authority lied.
For 500 years, society in general said,
yes,
10 commandments are pretty good laws to follow. Let's codify those.
Yep.
You know,
and that's why you've seen this use now. Some of the term post-Christian, and not just postmodern, is people trying to say, no, we want to move away. Because if you go back to even the era before that, before the Reformation, it's a different representation, and the authority is within the church. So even if you're not a member of the Catholic Church, your life is controlled by the Catholic Church, right? It's still the authority, and had been that for a long time. So sometimes the reason that phrase post-Christian is used is it's trying to show we're not going to let anything in the domain of Christianity be the authority on the other side when this shakes out. So it's a very real search for what's going to fit there and what's going to drive that.
I was at a national conference a couple of years ago, and there was from one of the well-known research organizations, might have been Barna, don't quote me on that, but he said that their research has shown that the number of people committed to the Christian faith, the percentage in America really hadn't changed. What had changed was there used to be a buffer of society that generally accepted Judeo-Christian principles to live by. 10 Commandments are a good thing. Do unto others, golden rule, good thing, right? Society as a whole kind of practiced that didn't necessarily going to church, right? That was the American way. Was you're good to your neighbors, you're good. The community comes together, tries to do the right things for the right reasons. So there was this population that was okay with living out, what we would call Judeo-Christian values. And then there was this percent of the population that's like, I don't really want anything to do with God. And what their research has shown is the hardcore people that try to live daily to biblical guidelines hadn't really changed from their research. What had changed was the buffer between the people that were just generally found that way of lifestyle acceptable to the good, clean living, and so that buffer percentage has been shrinking to where more and more people are identifying as I don't want anything to do with the way we've lived the last hundreds of years.
Yeah, and here's something that maybe will bring hope depending on where you're at in the conversation. We tend to have these kind of moves as pendulum swings. And quite often we swing the pendulum too far. Doesn't matter who you are, it swings too far.
Just not every area of life.
Again, if you look back to the Reformation and you see this defiance of the Catholic Church and papal order, and you see this sort of, I think about it sometimes as if you're swinging on a rope. Eventually you're going to get smaller and smaller unless you have something you're pushing off against. So a lot of times in these, the initial push is I'm holding onto the rope, I'm putting my feet against something, and I'm launching myself away from it. And you launch out further than where you actually want to be. And so you see even after the Reformation, over a period of time, certain traditions come back in to begin to bring order. And so I think that's part of what we may see in this shakeup. There are some things, and this buffer may have grown. We may see that shift back over time as people go, well wait a minute, that actually, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're pretty good at throwing the baby out with the bathwater in these things. And so part of that shakeout will probably involve, it makes sense that for a while that buffer would get really small. Where are we at 50, 100 years from now? We may see it back more to
I'm hearing
normalcy.
And it's could have been there, but it seems what I'm being exposed to is I'm hearing more and more atheists talk about being kind, being, there's a right way to do things. And if you're a good human, the expectation is that you would give part of your abundance to others that are in need. There's no spiritual, in their mind, there's no spiritual reason for that. Now, a Christian would say, well, but there's scripture that supports that concept. They're arriving at, it's just to be a good human, you should be kind to people. You should help those in need. You see somebody hurting, offer to,
Even within that world, some of the most prominent atheists in the last 10, 15 years have admitted that a true atheistic, there is no God, there is no moral authority position leads to some really bad outcomes. And we've had some prominent atheists that have come back and said, yeah, you're right. Even though I'm in this camp and I don't believe in a God, there has to be something greater. Some moral compass, some moral agreement. Mm-hmm. And how do you arrive at that? So it's interesting to see that happening.
Yeah, and we talk about the forefathers, and we often paint them as a bunch of Christians, or lately, the other extreme is to paint them as a bunch of drunks and
right
and horrible people. And like all pendulums, it's probably somewhere in between. But not all those guys that signed the Declaration of Independence were hardcore. They were open to the idea that there could be a God, but they weren't necessarily.
Pretty much all of them were either theist or deist, and fall into that category. Mm-hmm. But because they're theists and deists, and because they have this shared moral compass and worldview, they can all, in agreement, write, we believe you're endowed with certain inalienable rights given by our Creator. Mm-hmm. Like they had this common place of
all
shared.
Men are created equal.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So they found the common ground,
right?
Instead of getting stuck on the extremes,
right?
And I think it feels like we've lost or losing that in this shakeout. And is that just inevitable of part of the 500-year cycle?
We've lost the ability to find common ground. Yeah, I think there's an element of it that there's an inevitability to it, because it's a conflict. It's a conflict for change, and it becomes more than a generation gap. So if we look historically and what's the most common, there's always a generation gap between generation gaps. Most generation gaps are nothing more than behavioral gaps. They're involve some degree of rebellion, some degree of control, some degree of independence. Like mm-hmm. Those are all behavioral issues. So
my parents behaved this way, and this is what I got, so I'm going to behave differently.
Or my parents told me this, and I'm going to be defiant to it, right? So the example I've used in the past is, when we were growing up, or older generations even more so, if mom and dad said, you don't wear this, you don't wear a green shirt, and you wore a green shirt, it was an open act of defiance. It was a behavioral issue. Mm-hmm. When you're dealing with the generation gaps in the middle of these early onset transitions, it's not just a behavioral issue. It is behavioral, but it's also a worldview issue, mm-hmm. in which mom and dad say, don't wear the green shirt. You wear the shirt. Mom and dad flip their lid, and the kid's literally going, how is this shirt green?
I'm not defying you. I'm just expressing.
Yeah, I'm not defying you. I just don't see this like, I see it's got some green in it, but it's got other colors in it too. It's not all green, right? And so there become these worldview things, and I think that's what causes a lot of conflict is we don't believe other people when they say that they truly have a view that's different than ours. Mm-hmm. We believe they're lying. They're lying either to us or they're lying to themselves.
How synonymous is worldview with the word philosophy?
There's definitely connections between the two,
but they're not the same. Exclusively the same.
Worldview is a little more lived out than philosophy.
Okay. So one can be a mental assent. The mm-hmm. other is. So worldview is attempting to say, I live this way, I behave this way.
Yeah, but I think
whereas philosophy is more of a mental recognition.
Yeah, I think the first place we can probably find common ground is philosophically, because we can think outside of our own actions and mm-hmm. worldview, mm-hmm. right? We can philosophically opine and then reason it doesn't make sense. I remember at one point sitting around with some guys in high school, and we came to the conclusion that the only thing that really truly existed were the things that we had personally seen and experienced. that the Eiffel Tower didn't exist. It was in some studio somewhere. We carried this all the way out to when you get on a plane, it's all a simulation. Like we had this long, and we thought we were having such an intelligent philosophical conversation.
So some of your guys eventually wrote The Matrix.
Yes, exactly. And so so we went down this long, rabbit hole philosophically, but it wasn't going to change our worldview and how we lived. And of course, later we look back at that and go, what were we?
It was a fun mental exercise.
It was a mental exercise. But I think that does give us a place to maybe find some common ground. If we can philosophically understand other people, then will give us some insight into their worldview and how they're practicing.
Is worldview a choice versus a upbringing?
Well, yes, to an extent. So back to the philosophy and worldview. So philosophical thinking and philosophy is unbounded because it exists all in the mind. Worldview, by definition, is bounded by trying to come to points of boundary, points of definition, points of parameter within it. There are elements of worldview that can be choice, but only if you're intentional. I think that's the key point. We float through most of life. And so because of that, we become conditioned in our thinking and worldview without ever actually thinking about it. Mm-hmm. It's the conversation we were having right before this about comfort. Mm-hmm. Right? We don't realize that we're creatures of comfort, that we prefer comfort over everything else. And so unless we're willing to do the intentional thinking and the digging, it's really hard to shift worldview and make it a choice. We're just conditioned. We're conditioned by the education system. We're conditioned by the church. We're conditioned by our parents. We're conditioned by all of these things. And very seldom, without trying to be rebellious, do we stop and intentionally go, let's analyze this and let's dig on it. And let's realize this is just conditioned thinking.
So I have two questions, and then maybe we'll put a bow on this segment. How does one become aware that they have a worldview? And you don't have to answer them in this order. And then based on your research and reading, how many concurrent worldviews are there right now? Because I remember in high school, they used to try to say there's like 8 worldviews.
Yeah. Well, everyone has a worldview by nature because your worldview is the lens by which you process the world and interact with the world and see the world. So whether you're cognitively aware of that or not, much less cognitively aware of what the elements of that worldview are, it comes down to, are you willing to do the introspection and do the work? Mm-hmm. So it begins with choice. Mm-hmm. Are you willing to examine how you interact with the world and view the world? As far as the second question, how many different worldviews are there? There are many. There are many that are out there, and there's variations and sub-variations.
Are there any big buckets that's commonly agreed upon?
I don't know if we've defined those with post-modernity, because post-modernity, part of it being this relativism. Now, if we wanted to put big sweeping brushstrokes on it, we could narrow that down a lot more. It's I'll do it with
is it generally like Eastern thought and Western thought?
Eastern thought and Western thought certainly
kind of high level
have some things to do with that. Mm-hmm. Culture has some things to do with that. We've talked before about even the difference between Christian worldview and biblical worldview, which sound at face value to be the same, except biblical worldview constrains Christian worldview and gives it more structure. But even that is a difference, right? So Eastern thought, very okay with very unstructured worldview. Western civilization looks for a little more structure in that. The move to relativism, some would argue, has given everyone the authority to have their own worldview, right? Each person gets to define it themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even in some of the AI seminars I've participated in recently, they're talking about personal AI and how it would actually strengthen the individuality of basically, you could have, everybody could have their own individual religion because AIs helped them strengthen their unique views.
And we could see this carried out, and I want to end with a point of hope here. We could see this carried out in a number of other things that are results and symptoms of this, right? Individualism versus communalism, right? I would argue, created in the image of God in the Imago Dei, that we're created to be in relationship, and we have an inherent desire for community and connection. And the data sort of supports that. The more individualistic we've moved, the more we've seen anxiety, depression skyrocket, right? So individualism doesn't seem to really lead to fulfillment. Fulfillment happens in community. We're just in a period where we're having to test that, and most people are having to test that. Now, the other thing I'll say that with in the postmodern world and in those who endorse to relativism, you could sort of put it this way: if you grew up in a modern world and you think of it as a circle, right? There's a cross in the middle of the circle, which is the center of gravity, which is this moral compass church. In the early stages, what people would want to say is that in the move to post-modernity, the center of that circle, the gravity, became me or experience. I would argue that's actually not correct. That me or experience is the process by trying to figure out what's in the center. But really what happened in the shift is we don't know what's in the center of that universe as the source of gravity anymore. But now here's the good news. What we see in younger generations, and this goes back, when I say younger generations, at this point we're talking probably 40 and under. What we see from them is if they truly go on a concerted quest to determine their worldview and what the center of their universe is, and they do that over a period of time, whatever conclusions they arrive at tend to actually be more grounded and have a higher gravitational pull with more authenticity than even the older generations who had the church or the cross at the center. So when you see a young person today who has gone through a process, has adopted a faith and a worldview and all of these things and made that the center of their universe, their devotion to it's actually a lot deeper than our generation is.
I'm even meeting more and more people, though, that aren't sure where they are on the faith journey, but they're saying, I've got a hole and only community's filling it. Right. And
it's part of the reason we have all these echo chambers. Part of our division at its core is actually a search for community. So echo chambers and social media chat rooms and all these things are springing up around people wanting someone to connect with. What we did, because of technology, you can remember technology is a big part of the shift. What happened in this is we broadened everyone's world. I grew up in a town of 4,000, 4,500 people. There were just things I wasn't exposed to. And so if there was something unique about me, it was unique because there was no one else in the town that was going to have that. Well, now with technology, you can find someone else that has that, and then you can find someone else, and you can find someone else, and you can find someone else. The negative is you let that thing then become the source of your identity and your core identifying thing rather than actually the majority of who you are. But that's part of the struggle we're going through in this time as well, is it also begins to allow you to realize, well, I'm not abnormal in that there's no one else like me. But I think sometimes they've thrown off but I'm still abnormal in the greater sense of society because I've got 500 people in this chat room that I can go and talk to who are just like me. Right? But that doesn't change the fact you're still in town of 4,500 and the other 40,000, 499 people aren't there, or whatever the math is. So that's part of this. That's part of why this shakeup is. There's not an easy way through it. But the hope is the people who do the work and go on the quest, what emerges in that is a great desire for community, a great desire for internal and external peace, and a great desire for some parameter that they can build their life around. And that, to me, is opportunity.
And they're more bought into it because they did the exercise.
And if they buy in, they really, truly buy in.
That's good. Well, I want to bring this segment to a close, and I promised the listeners and viewers at the beginning you were going to predict the winners. The polls close in about 4 hours. So what's your prediction?
Wow.
For the record, this is the 2024 election of the United States president.
Great.
And so you got to pick a winner.
How to win friends and influence people. Man, you're asking me to be about as political as I can be. Okay. I'll go this course. If I look at this sociologically, I think the indicators are that Trump wins. And by that, I mean you're looking deeper than the data. You're looking at trend lines and which side has made the most shifts to try and allow that to happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not the popularity of a candidate or anything. That's not what I mean by sociologically. If I look at this from just a data-driven, I would say it's Harris. What's interesting is if you took both those terms, data-driven and sociology, and you tried to apply them to what we would assume are the sides of worldviews, you would probably reverse that. Just realize that as I'm saying that. So who wins? I think Trump wins.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll find out next week or 2 weeks when this show airs. It will have already been recorded. And hopefully the counts will be done by then. We won't have this thing drag on for months.
Yeah, great.
So, all right. Good deal. All right.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of A Leader's Journey podcast. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to our channel.